Really good to be here. This is a special privilege, actually, to be here with what's happening today with Mark and your family, Mark, too. So um, it's sorry that Dave is not here, but we talked about this, and so I get the privilege of bringing a message of, I think, what's pertinent for where you're at today and for all of us where we are at in life. It has been very, very exciting for Judy and I for the last couple of years as we have worked with Mark, as we watched him as a reluctant, maybe I should think about going to this thing in Papua New Guinea, to hardly arriving there, seeing what God was doing, listening to what God was saying to his heart and saying, this is me, this is what I have to do. And so this has been an incredible journey for Mark. And as the oldies, we have been totally blessed to be a part of this. We love to see the younger generation. Hopefully that's better. Yeah. Yeah, so it's been a privilege to be a part of, Mark's just one of many, of the younger generation listening to what God is saying and stepping forward in their lives to be a part of that. As you can imagine, going forward, looking beyond the next few years of training, Mark has seen something of the lostness that exists out there. He's seen something of the remoteness of the places that Ethnos New Zealand and our global partners work amongst. And he's seen what isolated tribes look like. And it could be like that anywhere in the world that the Lord eventually places Mark. Now, none of that comes natural or easy. Even right now, stepping forward to go to the States for 2 years, closing off your opportunity of earning a living, none of that comes natural or easy. There is going to be all kinds of challenges, all kinds of obstacles, and all kinds of hardships to navigate along the way. And that is the same for any of us in our own personal Christian experience as we journey more towards more Christ-likeness. And in reality, I think it's pretty safe to say that we have all faced challenges and we will still continue to face challenges and varying degrees of impossibilities as we progress forwards in our Christian life. So this morning, let's have a look at this. We'll call it Stepping into the Impossible through the eyes of Israel and the impossibility of the flooded Jordan River right in front of them. Now, you all know the story, but let's revisit this as we go to Joshua chapter 3 and starting off into verses 2 and 3. After 3 days, the officers went throughout the camp, giving orders to the people. When you see the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord your God and the priests who are Levites carrying it, you are to move out from your positions and follow it. So this is an amazing time in Israel's history, and they are at the end of their wilderness wanderings, but now the flooded Jordan River stops them. It's in the way of, it separates them from what God has promised them. And for us, at many times, that can be the same for us in our Christian journey. We can be so easily stuck wandering round and round in circles with something blocking us from what God has for us. And many times that is going to require action on our part to move beyond that. For Israel, it started with a mobilizing of the people. So mobilizing is organizing or activating for action. And this began as the officers went throughout the camp, giving orders to the people. And for us, that is like taking notice of the instructions that we've been given by our pastors, by our teachers, through our own personal reading of God's word, and then being doers of it. Joshua had commanded the officers to relay the instructions that God had given him. Specific instructions that when they saw the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant, they were to move out from their positions and follow it. So those were the people's marching orders. But notice what they were told to follow: the Ark of the Covenant. And you see, this signified the Lord's throne amongst them and also his power. So really, they were told to follow the Lord himself into the land that he had long promised them. Now that's a pretty good pattern for us, right? To follow the Lord through whatever obstacle we face. For Israel, this was not going to be without some effort on their part. First up, they had to be watching out for when God was going to move. Next, they had to be ready to pack up their camp. Thirdly, God had a task for them once they got across the Jordan. And in a way, all of this is very similar for us. Just like Israel had to watch for when the ark was going to move so that they could follow it, we too are to be watching for when the Lord wants to move in our lives. And we've seen that personally with you, Mark. You were watching for when the Lord was moving. And also, not just for what he's moving, but what he may want to move us into. In the life of the church or missions, are we looking for what God is doing and for what he may want to do in our lives? What he has gifted us for within that. Just like the Israelites, they had to pack up their tents, they had to leave camp, and for us there is the packing up and leaving of our desires and what we want to do if we are going to follow the Lord in some way. In long-term missions, this becomes a literal packing up of everything and leaving everything behind. If we don't, that will prevent us from going. And right there is the reason why there is such a shortage of workers on foreign mission fields. For Israel, God was mobilizing them to an inheritance, the promised land. But there was also a task ahead for them, and that was to wipe out the people that lived there because their sin had reached levels that God could no longer overlook. Leviticus 18 tells us that a large portion of their wickedness was their depraved sexual activity. And that should be a reminder to us today that God has not changed the boundary lines on human sexuality. And there are consequences for those who live ignoring his laws. As Christians, we too have been mobilized to an inheritance out future and to a present task. For our future inheritance, we are expected to be in preparation by living how God instructs, clean-handed in all our dealings, and in purity, abstaining from all appearance of evil. 1 Thessalonians 5:22. And for our task, now this is a scary thought because it is to wipe out the wickedness we find in the land. If we liken the land to our lives, we are to wipe out the wickedness we find there. Just like the Hebrews 12 athlete example. Let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles us. You see, not living like that will hinder our relationship with Christ, and as well as evangelism and mission work that we've been called to do. So the responsibility is ours. And we should know that to follow what God has for us, and Mark, this applies to you, we will run into many challenges. Israel did. And here right in front of them is the Joshua 3:15 tells us the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. And then in Joshua 4:19 it tells us this was the 10th day of the first month, which is April, that is spring. So what would be an easily crossed river in the height of summer, maybe only around a metre deep in places, It was now a swift-flowing river with all the spring rains and all the mountain snow from Mount Hermon in the north. This was impossible for such a large crowd of people. Including all the children, there was somewhere around 3 million people. And don't forget, there was all their animals and all of their belongings as well. No worries to God, who many times uses the impossible to test us, to grow us, and to show us his great power. Just like 40 years before, when Israel left Egypt, they were cut off by the Red Sea, and then Pharaoh's army is coming on in behind. Impossible. Just like for them as a nation, living for 40 years in the desert without food. Impossible. Just like for Judy and I, when we finished our missionary training as a family with a clear direction to get on over to the Philippines with no $5,000 laying around to get us there. Impossible. But that very day, we got a call from our home church saying, a gift of $5,000 has come in for you. Where do you want it? Impossible, but God. As someone has said, when there is nothing left but God, that is when you find out that God is all you need. So impossibilities, we can look at them as God's classroom of further teaching for his people. But guess what? They are also the bully playground of the devil, where he will do everything he can to tell us that we can't do it or we shouldn't do it, with hundreds of good reasons why not. He'll make that same old of camp look pretty appealing and far more comfortable than stepping into that river of impossibility. And then when he's done that, he will laugh because he's robbed us of the very thing that God had for us, every blessing that he had for us. So it's important that we understand the theology of impossibilities correctly. For the most part, God doesn't let us face them in the ease of summer stillness. Rather, they're usually going to be in the rather all too familiar spring floods of life. Then, as well, these impossibilities are often a test for us to learn something from. Think about it this way: as individual believers, we have that impossible task of our new nature, the new person we are in Christ, living against that old nature that we are, that fight that exists. As believers in the life of the church, we have that impossible task of working together in perfect unity so that there's never any division or strife, right? In missions, there's the impossibility of so few who are prepared for the long haul work that it is to work amongst about 1/3 of the world's population that have never heard the gospel in a meaningful way. We all, as believers, have been mobilized as the Lord's servants, whether we like that or not. And it all boils down to a choice. That choice will result in forward momentum or motionless. So what are we this morning? Second point here is the miracle itself. And in Joshua 3:16, we read that the water from upstream stopped flowing, it piled up in a heap. Now, this is an amazing miracle of God. Some commentators are saying that he may have used an earthquake or slips to create this, and that's possible because sometimes God does use natural events to achieve his purposes. He did that when Israel crossed the Red Sea. You'll remember that he used a strong east wind all night to divide the waters. And so here too, it's possible that God may have used a landslide to pile the water up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan. You see, this area is an area where landslides are common in the soft clay riverbanks, and history records that landslides have dammed up the river back in 1267 AD and 1927. In 1927, a landslide cut off the river flow for about 21 hours. But let's move aside from the natural aspects. We need to look at the supernatural hand of God in this. There's at least four things happening here. And the first up is the distance. The town of Zarethan is believed to be about 30 kilometres north of where the Israelites were. So there is no way that they would have seen what was happening further upstream. Second thing is the timing. For it to be cut off that far north, there would be quite some time for the remaining water to run out down past where the Israelites were. And yet in verse 15 and 16, the text is explicit. As soon as the priest's feet touched the water's edge, the water stopped flowing. They didn't have to wade out up to their chest, wait for the water to drop down to their waist, wait for it to get down to their knees until just finally their feet were showing. The original language is very specific. Just when their feet dipped into the water, it stopped flowing. It was instant. Judy and I, one time, we saw God's instant timing just like that when we had to evacuate our village in the Philippines. There was a band of mercenaries coming with their M16s coming after us. It was a beautiful, clear morning, but by the time we were ready to leave, God sent one of the heaviest tropical downpours that we had ever seen as a cover that lasted just long enough for us to get out to safety. And that started the moment we got in the 4x4 and shut the door as we headed out of the village. Third thing here is the dryness amongst the flooding. Notice what verse 17 tells us. The priests stood firm on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan. Now what's interesting here is the wording here doesn't just mean exposed or uncovered ground that was covered in water. It's very specific wording that is used for desert and for dry ground. Literally translated, this would read, in the drained area, and describing how we would see a drained out riverbed in the height of a summer drought. Maybe looking a bit like this, the dry riverbed. It's the same root word that is used. Remember when Gideon asked the Lord for a wet fleece and the ground all around is dry? The priests were not standing in water. They were not standing in mud. They were not standing in wet sand like when the tide has gone out. They had got wet feet when they stood on the river's edge, but then they were standing in desert dry ground, and all the people they crossed in desert dry conditions rather than mud or water. And fourthly is the duration of this miracle. It lasted while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. Remember, this is some 3 million people, all of their animals, all of their belongings, and everything that made up the tabernacle. This was a long time period, but it had a very definitive ending. In Joshua 4:18 we read, the priests came up out of the river carrying the ark of the covenant of the Lord. No sooner had they set their feet on dry ground than the waters of the Jordan returned to their place and ran at flood stage as before. So from some blockage 30 kilometres away, the timing, the dryness, and the exact duration, this has the fingerprints of God all over it. Israel saw a mighty miracle that day. And here's something good to notice. God didn't expect his people to go through something he couldn't take them through. And that's the same for us. Also, another thing here, God at work and faith often go hand in hand. You see, the priests had to take that first step of faith by stepping into that river's edge. It was faith that kick-started that miracle. And that's one of the things we find with many of the students that we work with. Some never go because they don't take that step like what you're taking today. It's a step of faith, and God will take you through that. Today, the church collectively and us individually, like Israel, we are on a journey of faith while we are here in this life. God intends that we continue it with that heavenly promised land in view. And there is going to be many rivers of impossibility along the way. They are there to grow our faith. And like Leonard Ravenhill says, faith laughs at the impossibilities. So whatever we are facing, are we willing to take that step of faith through those impossibilities that we face? Are we willing to leave the comfort and predictability of whatever our camp looks like? You see, it's always a miracle when a Christian mobilizes to follow the Lord deeper in his relationship, or when somebody is called into missions. By continuing on in that, there are the miracles, there are the providences of God, there's all those amazing coincidences that he allows. And now we come to the memorial that they set up to remember what God had just done for them. In Joshua chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, he said, "Choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, from right where the priests stood, and to carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight." So this is far more than just a pile of rocks. Straight up, we notice that God was very specific in his instructions. It was to be built from specific stones taken from right where the priests stood. Stones that were taken from the very spot where God was at work that day. Stones that were a reminder of not what was achieved through the priests, but through God himself. And then there was to be a specific amount of stones, one to represent each tribe. You see, all 12 tribes had been a part of what God just did for them. None of them were excluded. And then there was a specific purpose, and this purpose is dual in its scope. Firstly, it was to remind Israel nationally and individuals personally what God had just done for them on that day. And second half of Joshua 4:24 spells this out so that you might always fear the Lord your God. See, it was all about fearing what God can allow as consequences for disobedience on the one hand, and then on the other hand, a holy reverence that anticipates what God can do with a people who fully trust him. And so here, with this simple visual, he could point out and pass on to future generations the reality of what a mighty God they serve. This was a direct command from God because he knew how quick people would forget about him, forget about what he had done once life settled down and things became easy. A visual reminder is good for any of us to help us reflect on what God has done. And this is something that any of us can do and that can encourage our faith. We can use it as a teaching tool as we disciple our children or our grandchildren or any others in the church. It's something that any of us can do. And this is where I usually pull out a piece of rubber hose that I don't have with me today, but it's a piece of hose I show that is from a car that we had in 98 and 99 when we were in missionary training that serves as a memorial to us of God's faithfulness. At that time, we had very little financial support. We had very little opportunity to earn anything because we were full-time students. We watched others who were well supported from their churches. We saw how the Lord provided a car for one of the other students. And at that time, Judy said something to the Lord like, "Are you going to be there like that for us when we need it?" And then not long after that, this heater hose on our car blew, which caused our engine to overheat, which meant that it had to get rebuilt. And then almost at the same time, before the bills were due, the Lord provided a long forgotten tax refund that came within $6 of what we needed. That sits as a memorial to us that God is faithful to keep us in whatever He mobilises us into. And of course, when God does things like that, we have to watch ourselves that our focus stays on Him and not what He just did. Otherwise, there's a risk that becomes idolatry. And the other side is when things don't go like we expect or hope, we have to guard our hearts from unbelief. Another thing that God intended for this memorial was way bigger than just personal or the nation of Israel. This was panoramic for the world. And God states this in the first part of the verse. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful. The all-powerful God at work among His people so that they could carry out what He had asked of them, to move into the land as a kingdom of priests and as a holy nation, to rid the land of sin and to make Him known throughout the whole world. And as we know, for the most part, Israel hasn't been too good at doing that. And the same goes for us as the church today. We don't have it all sorted as we should either. But the fact remains, God expects us to rid ourselves of sin and to make Him known throughout the world. The obvious is, I guess, how can all the peoples of the earth know that the hand of the Lord is powerful if they don't know of Him? There are hundreds and hundreds of entire culture and language people groups who have never heard of Him. They don't know that there is a Lord who is far more powerful than the puny gods that they are enslaved to. In Papua New Guinea, the Mamiami people had supposedly heard bits and pieces of the gospel, but when our missionaries dug in a little, it became clear that they had no idea of what it was all about. After some explanation, one of the teachers said, "If God's talk were like a pineapple, so far we've only tasted the pineapple leaves." Interpretation of that is they've heard hasty little bits and pieces of the gospel in the trade language, which they have very limited understanding of. And some of that is zero understanding of. It's not their talk place. It's not their, it's vague to them. It doesn't mean much to them. It's not their heart language. And so it's about as appetizing to them as pineapple leaves. And that's why he then said, "We need you to cut it open for us so that we can taste the meat." So it's exactly what our missionaries did. They moved in to live amongst the people. They learned their language for 5 years. And then they cut open the gospel in the heart language of the people so that many of them could understand the sweetness of Jesus' sacrifice for them in their place. That was the first Mamiami church born just a little over 18 months ago. So right there is a memorial of God's grace, His redeeming grace. It's also a sweet memorial for the missionary team of what God let them be a part of. They will never forget that time there. It also becomes a shared memorial for anyone on the wider support team outside of the village, those who as well were the financial and prayer supporters back home. That's because it's all about a partnership for those who pray or for support missions. even for those who are actively involved or invested in the life of the local church. And as we all grow, hopefully you too are building memorials of what you are seeing God doing through some of the impossibilities that you face and how He's leading you through them. Well, this morning we've touched on flooded rivers that surround us and how there within that there is the mobilizing, the miracles, and there is the memorials. If we are mobilized, let us not get weary in well-doing and never settle for the comfort of the camp on the wrong side of the river. Once we are mobilized, we will see the miracles of God that He allows us to be a part of. And then there will be the memorials to our great God and what He is doing, so that all people on earth might know Him. So therefore, as we close today, let us look for our part. Let nothing stop us from stepping into the impossible. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to share on this special occasion, and thank you that we can be a part of you as we are a part of Mark, as Mark becomes a part of the whole picture of what God's doing. I pray that as a church that you are able to run with this vision with Mark and that he feels totally supported by you all. Thank you again, and I believe we are closing off with a final song. So, thank you.